It's great to be back in Brighton and good to see all of you again. Our session today is on security for MacAdmins. The reason why we're doing this presentation today is because we think this is an important change that's happening in our industry, that MacAdmins are going to increasingly need to be involved with security and understand what's going on with security. So we thought we would provide an opportunity just to talk about some of the fundamentals, things that are important to everyone to know, and share what little I know and a lot of what Sid knows. I'm Weldon Dodd. I'm the SVP of Community at Kandji, and I'm a MacAdmin. This is my colleague Sid.
Hey everybody, Sid Rowe. I am a security solutions engineer by title, but I too am a Mac security admin.
Sid and I actually have known each other for quite a long time. We both have worked at the fruit company, at the fruit stand, and been in that orbit, right, for quite a long time. At one point, Sid had gone to work for a very large financial institution in the United States, a very, very large retail banking organization. I was still doing professional services work, and we got to know each other on a project there. And we've been friends since. We have a few things in common. We're both musicians. So Sid plays what?
Drums and keys, but I've been doing it for about 6 or 7 years, and I always tell people I'm just getting started. Right?
Yeah, right on. I played bass for a long time, although my 5th child, I have to say, kind of broke me, and I hung it up, and I haven't been playing out at gigs for the last 10 years or so. But for 30, 35 years of my life, I played a lot of music, and that's something that we have in common. So we thought we'd bring a little bit of that flavor to our presentation today and talk about security musically. Our agenda, we want to talk about hardening the endpoints, what you can do to secure macOS itself, how to manage vulnerabilities with software that you've installed, how to identify first and respond to threats that might arise, and we'll wrap up with compliance. Now, when we talk about hardening, we want to talk about the security controls that are in place on macOS, the things that you're probably already doing and familiar with. Talk about those a bit. It's a bit like with music, right? One of the first steps is to learn your instrument and to really master it. Now, it's a bit intimidating to come up on stage here and talk to an audience that includes virtuosos, really masters of their instrument. It's something like Charles mentioned, the Grateful Dead playing between Jimi Hendrix and The Who, right? I feel a bit the same here talking to you about managing Macs, but still, there's something to be learned there. We want to master the instrument. That's how we can begin to create music. Now, I became a bass player somewhat by accident. I played saxophone in elementary school when I was younger. At about the age of 12, I was in middle school in the United States, 7th and 8th grade, and the bass player for the jazz band at my middle school had graduated up to the next school. So there was no bass player, and I was adjacent to the rhythm section, and so it just kind of ended up that I raised my hand and said, sure, I'll take it. That might sound familiar. That's probably how many of you became MacAdmins, right? Where the guy in front of you had moved on, the position was open, you happened to be there, and you stuck your hand up and said, sure, I'll be the MacAdmin. But a lot of what we want to talk about here is just fundamentals that you're probably familiar with, right? We're going to talk a little bit about passwords, screen lock, and encryption. Yep. These are things that you can enforce with MDM. So say, like, for passwords.
Yeah, there's, guys, we're not going to cover anything that you don't already know. But when we're talking about learning your instrument here, right, we start looking at it from 2 different lights, right? There's the password when it comes to the user side, which we know is not necessarily the best experience. But then if I were to look at what can a user do when it comes to security, that's not even a thing, right? So MDM is absolutely needed in that particular regard. We'll look at that in just a second. Same thing with lock screen. There's one thing about turning it on that doesn't cut that doesn't pay the bill. You have to do a little bit more when it comes to adhering to security. So you're going to hear a lot of security stuff from the security guys, so be prepared, right? It's coming. But then lastly, FileVault and encryption. We'll go through that, right? It's kind of a mixed bag. It's easy to turn on, but do users know what's really happening there, right? We have to figure that out and actually work through it a little bit. So let's look at from the MDM side, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's look at each one of these really quick. So setting a compliant password, there's a few controls available. What are the important ones?
Yeah, really, it's all about like making sure it's complex enough, making sure it's long enough. How many of you have heard these before, right? We've all heard this. No, come on, you're gonna raise your hands. We're gonna okay. So it's gotta be complex, it's gotta be, 12 characters, special, alphanumeric, can't be simple, things like that, right? And so MDM definitely gives us a couple references for us to meet that security complexity.
Yeah, and this is the way for us to enforce this across the organization to make sure that everyone's complying with the standards that we've set. This interacts with lock screen in an interesting way, right? The controls here specify when that password has to be used. So it's great that you set a passcode policy and enforcing a length requirement, but here it interacts with lock screen to make sure that you're requiring it when the computer wakes up from sleep or when the screensaver is dismissed, et cetera.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Sid?
I think the lock, like being able to kind of nuke the device or get into some kind of data protection mode, right? When you look at security compliance frameworks and things like that, it'll start mentioning how complex do we want to get something as simple as configuring the lock screen. So again, back to the MDM to help us with that.
Cool. Moving on, disk encryption. So again, the user could enable FileVault on their own, but enabling it with MDM is going to be, well, it means that you can enforce it consistently. Yeah. But there's another component too here in terms of unlocking. Yeah.
Anybody know, if you're just a regular user, once you turn it on, what are the 2 ways to recover? iCloud is one, and then the other one is? Recovery key, right? So who's keeping that key? The user, right? Like how does that work for an organization? It really doesn't, right? And how many organizations allow you to use iCloud, right? Slim to none. But really and truly, it comes down to being able to recover. So when you kind of think about that, it's not so much of turning on FileVault, it's so much of being able to get back out of it, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a couple factors that we want to look at from a security perspective. Who's going to hold the key, right? We want to hold it as maybe the admins and be good stewards there, so we kind of start moving into the security space. We want to rotate, and we can specify, usually an MDM will help you do that as well, specify how many days do I want to rotate that key, and that's a pretty good security practice as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of my early days in the IT industry where we were doing tape backups, right? Mm-hmm. And backup is great, but what really matters is restore. And with tape, that wasn't always easy. Right. But with encryption keys, it's the same thing, right? Encryption is great, but what really matters is decryption. Yeah. And if you're trying to maintain company assets and the laptops that are out in your organization, having those keys in escrow so that you can decrypt them when you need to is really critical. MDM enables all of that to happen. So that's hardening. Just think of it again as maybe mastering your instrument, getting really proficient. Most of us have put in that effort already, but there's other ways to contribute. There's other ways to be a musician. And we want to talk about that as well with vulnerabilities. So here, the analogy that we'll try to make is like playing with other people, playing in a band, in an environment, and understanding how things interact with each other. So a lot of vulnerabilities actually consist of software interacting with the platform that it's on or in the environment that it is. So we're going to try to break this down and share a little bit about vulnerabilities.
Anybody know Kevin Mitnick? Show of hands? All right. So he's kind of famous in the security world, right? But he's got a good quote that I like referring to, that hackers are becoming more sophisticated in conjuring up new ways to hijack your system by exploiting technical vulnerabilities or human nature. And that's a really good anchoring quote. Because I think as we look at these intersections, again, the first one was what? Liberal arts and technology. Sure. And then we're kind of at this crossroads again where it's like IT administration and security. You guys following a pattern here? And then we have application and platform, right? All these intersections, we need some streetlights. But nevertheless, vulnerabilities happen. If you're going to go jam out with your next musician, you may be good, he may be good, she may be good. But when you get together, we may find, we're not quite as cohesive as we thought.
We're going to take a specific example here and just walk through the details that we can learn from the National Vulnerability Database. This is maintained by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies in the United States. There's something equivalent here in the UK with critical vulnerability disclosures, which add on to this, and you can learn a bit more, get some more context. But if you view this entry, you just want to break it down and share what's available to see. So here we can see the ID of the vulnerability. So this is really critical because it allows us to share information, make sure we're talking about the same item. We have when it was first published, when it was modified, but then lastly, it identifies that Chrome is the vulnerable piece of software. This is where the weakness exists, is in Chrome. Moving on through the page, right, there's a description here.
If I may, I want to detour just real quick. So he may get mad at me later, but why are we doing this? Can I give you all a real world example? Is that fair? So this large retail financial institute that I worked with, when I came into office, I was an information security officer. I had been privy to some of how things worked, and I'll share with you the details. What would happen is you'd have a security team who would go and look at this page, or technically, they would go see what was hot in the news. This is a CVE, you should be worried about this. And they didn't know why they should be worried about it. So back to the bank it comes, they're going, hey, hair on fire, is this a thing, right? And then you kind of go to the IT administrators and they go, guys, if you're describing this the right way, it doesn't sound like it's so critical. Anybody have that where it's like, hey, calm down? Anybody tell the security team, calm down, like it's not that deep? We don't have iMessage turned on, like chill out. This is what happened, right? And it's one of those things where you have this large organization not being able to go and really decipher what's happening here. So why are we going over this? It's just to show you what to look at in these key pieces. So this particular part is the description. So when we're on the page, this is where we hone in just to understand what are they talking about here. And I'm going to read. That one's a little hard to see, so I'm going to try to read it here. The description is basically breaking down the vulnerability that there's corrupt heap data. And then there's the potential to do injection of malicious code via HTML. Sound foreign? It's okay. We'll break it down. Heap data is normally, when I'm done working with an application, I have some freed up memory, right? That's heap data. This particular vulnerability was basically saying, hey, I could inject something into that use after free space. And we'll see that term in just a second. But then what happens, there's a consolidation on the system that says, I need to use that memory. And if you've got some squatting malicious code, then your next process just now got infected, right? So that's what this is telling us. Whether we think it's really going to happen or if it really applies to us, we're going to figure that out in just a second. So it's important to understand, what is this really saying? And if somebody weren't paying attention, they'd go, Chrome's bad, turn it off, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute. There was also a section that said that this only applied into dev tools, right? So it's important to read this section on the page.
Okay. If we scroll down a little bit further, this section explains the severity. So there's a base score here, a 7.5. This is considered a high score. So this is the first indication that something that you want to pay attention to, right? A 7.5 indicates there's some real danger here. But this score is made up of a few components, and looking a little bit deeper into it help you understand how it might impact your environment or your organization. So if we look at these pieces here, there's two sections. So first is the scoring, and I can't read it either. So but there's the base score, right? There is also a temporal component to the score and an environmental component to that. So the temporal or time-based component means that over time, is this getting worse or is it getting better? Are there mitigations in place? Are there other factors that have reduced the severity of this particular vulnerability? And then the environmental piece is something that you would need to evaluate. How does this affect us? How does this affect my organization? If you've chosen not to deploy Chrome, this is a simple example, and you deploy Safari, maybe Firefox or something, or Brave or some other browser instead, well, then this vulnerability doesn't apply to you. Sure, it's a 7.5, you want to pay attention and take a look at it, but you may not need to do anything because Chrome doesn't exist in your environment. So all of that together, you need to look at and evaluate to decide what is the severity for us, for my organization.
Yeah. So as we have those 3 metrics, one of the things you have to keep in mind is we have to standardize a little bit, right? So I can't base my judgment off of your environmental score, right? So that's not fair. And then temporally, I can't use that. So most of the time in the security world, matter of fact, how many security practitioners do we have? Anybody? Oh, just me, okay. But in this world, we try to stick to just the base score, right? So if I'm deciphering, what do I pay attention to? How do I properly go back to that table and understand the base score? It basically says, here's the attack vector as it stands. And then it has 2 categories inside of it, which is the impact and exploitability. You want to go over exploitability? You want me to just keep going?
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. When it comes to exploitability, we got 4 different sections there. You can kind of see them. But really, you want to take a look at things like, what is the vector? This is happening over the network, right? So we know that in this particular case, if I were to really wanted to go nuclear, I could like pull the plug on the network switch, right? That is not my recommendation. Don't do that. However, you have things like the attack complexity, meaning the attacker has to be pretty sharp. They have to know what they're doing. This is not a run-of-the-mill, oops, I clicked something kind of situation. No elevated privileges are required. So if it does make it to the box, it doesn't need to be an admin. It doesn't need to have special permissions. And then same thing, user interaction. It's required, and so that kind of thwarts some of this a little bit, because if you've done some of your security awareness trainings and things like that that us security guys make you guys do every year, then you'll know, don't click on that. So that's the exploitability side. And then we kind of have the other half, which is impact. Impact is like, if it got there, what would happen, right? So 3 categories inside of impact, which is confidentiality. Think of that as read, right? When we're thinking about attributes, we all know read, write. Confidentiality, it says, if this exploit got on the machine, could it read? What's the probability that it could read your documents, data, files, whatever the case may be? This one says high, all right? So understand how that looks. Same thing with integrity, but a little bit different. So if I had read, integrity would be right. You are right, and the answer is right. So integrity means that I can go and alter the file. I can alter the OS. So again, instead of somebody going, there's a new CVE, let's all take care of it, everybody do something from a IT administration perspective, we can literally start dissecting this and go, wait a minute, guys, hold on. We're looking at these vectors here. And then finally, availability, that talks about if let's say it's an application, if it's altered, right, it's no longer available to you in its whole form. So.
Okay. Further down on this page here, it lists the weakness enumeration. So this is the type of exploit. This one here is called free after use, so it's referring to this memory issue. And a number of different vulnerabilities might share the same weakness. They might use the same type of exploit. And so this is just an easy way to cross-reference across multiple vulnerabilities to find ones that share the same weakness. They might share some common characteristics. It might tell you a little bit about what the mitigation might be or how you might respond to it because of the type of attack that it's using or the type of vulnerability that it is exploiting. And then finally, down here at the bottom, it lists the known affected software configurations and the version number here, Sid.
Reading it.
Well, you don't read it out.
Oh, okay.
But,
yeah, this is just a long way of saying how many versions were impacted, right? And so as admins, we're worried about what versions do we have? Is it time to update? Yada, yada. So normally this is about where we come in, right? They're going to ask, what version are we on and can we update, right? This is way late in the game. Don't you guys feel like this is really late that they knock on the door here and they say, hey, what version? Let's go. You guys, we're showing this because you should have a seat at the table here. So this is just kind of rounding out that long page of information to dissect that just says, here are the versions that are impacted. But there's tools that are out there. You don't have to go and study these pages, right? Like, there's some great companies out there doing great work, like Rapid7's out there, VulnDB is out there, Tenable.io. Yeah, Tenable's got a pretty decent vulnerability management program. We're going to get into it with our device harmony story as well. But you don't have to go and figure this whole thing out from soup to nuts here, right? The idea is that you at least understand some of these terms, and we hope we're helping you out there. So,
yeah. Yeah, there's a couple issues here to just keep in mind, right, as you're thinking about how to incorporate vulnerability management into your practice. There are lots of vulnerabilities. There's lots on Mac OS and software that runs on Mac OS. And it's really hard to keep up with all of them, that fire hose of new CVEs that's coming at you. Some of the vendors that Sid mentioned offer a solution. Kandji's working on something. The places where those tools can add value is illustrated here with the version number. So like Chrome has a particular way of identifying version numbers, but not all vendors are consistent. And so, building those searches and looking at your systems to identify what version is out there oftentimes means that you have to look at each application separately and how they do version numbers. And sometimes, unfortunately, even the way that the applications are named isn't consistent across CVEs. And so that's where some of the tools can help out. But if you're in that reactive situation where someone in the C-suite or someone across the aisle from you in InfoSec has brought this to your attention and saying, hey, do we have a problem here? Do we need to look at this? At least you can be in the conversation by looking at the details that are here on the CVE page, look at it, evaluate what it means for you and your organization, how it might impact you so that you can develop a reasonable plan on how to respond to it. Yeah. For the most part, though, you have the tools to manage these vulnerabilities because typically we're talking about software that you deployed, that you want to be on your systems, and you're just trying to manage a potential exploit or potential vulnerability with that software. But let's look at the next category here. So with threats, we're really talking about software that you don't want, right? And what can you do to reduce your risk or manage your risk in those situations? So when we were thinking about our music analogy here, it's a little bit like playing live in front of an audience that you don't know or being out in the world at a venue that you don't have full control over. In today's world with remote work, hybrid work, people working from home, right, you don't control the environment that your systems or your endpoints are running in. And there might be threats to be aware of. So these could range, right? There could be something fairly, the impact of these kinds of threats could be something fairly innocuous or mild, like someone inserting an album into your iTunes library without you asking for it, looking at you, Bono, to something really dangerous, like pulling personally identifiable information off of an endpoint or getting secrets or keys or certs or something else off of that endpoint that would have a real risk to your organization. So let's talk through some of the components here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just real quick, just kind of teeing this up, we kind of go from vulnerabilities where we're taking precaution of software that we wanted. And we're moving to threats, and now instead of being taking precaution, we want to be preventative. These are the things we don't want. But in order to figure out, what is it that we don't want, we got to know what is it that we're looking for. We're going to have the right kind of tools, right? So that's the plug. We're going to start talking about the right way to start detecting things, right? But what is it that we're looking for? In today's world, we've really categorized it now into these two common terms, which is malware and potentially unwanted programs. And I think we're going to walk through a little bit of history here in just a second, a little bit of anatomy. But really and truly, when you think about potentially unwanted programs, just like Weldon was talking about, this is maybe something you wanted, like World of Warcraft, right? We need that in our organization. We need our Steam. I'm just kidding. But at some point, if you have that on your device, there could be some maliciously sought after side effects, right? So that's why they're considered potentially unwanted programs versus just vulnerabilities that need to be patched. Their intentions may be a little nefarious. But let's look at, as we look through malware and potentially unwanted programs, what exactly are we looking for?
So these threats, the malware pups, like Sid is talking about, they generally have three components, right? It's trying to do three things. It wants to infect the system or get installed. It wants to stay installed on that system and survive if the user logs out, logs back in, or if the system reboots. It wants to survive and run again. And then, of course, all of this is to achieve some sort of impact, whatever that might be. So let's look at each one of these three components here.
Yeah, I'll kind of walk through this one here, but really and truly, when it comes to threats, the first stage is infect, right? And that might be through user interaction, right? How do I get you to join me in a chat, click on something, log in here, download this software so it'll clean up your Mac. Yes, we're going to pick on MacKeeper here in just a little bit, but or update your payroll, right? Click. I got one the other day, and it actually scared me. I was driving, getting ready for this conference, and it said your Bank of America account had been used and spent $1,600, and I thought, did I order from Amazon? Like, I do that in my sleep sometimes. But sure enough, after I called my wife because I was driving, and she said, no, nobody's touched the money. It's all the accounts are good. And I thought, man, that was slick. That's a really good user interaction, like, vulnerability predator, right? Like, because I would have clicked on it, and I'm the security guy, right? So you kind of have that attack method. You also have a little bit of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Just again, we're going to beat up on MacKeeper just in a little bit, but if there is one of those vulnerabilities, like we were talking about Chrome just a second ago, you can get in that way, right? That's another way that somebody can actually move their way in. So lastly, supply chain. Anybody heard of a recent supply chain? Maybe started with a number? 3CX? Anybody say 3CX? All right, maybe it's just our side. But nevertheless, it can happen upstream or downstream, and then by the time you get it, you've already got all the weaknesses or the exploits that are involved in it. So that's just a couple ways to think about how things can actually get to the infection stage. But in order to really think about that, we need to look at what has happened over time, right? So let's watch this cat and mouse game, if you will. So the history of threat. You want to start? You want to go? Or
Sure, yeah.
All right, go for it.
I mean, the earliest threats that we have are simple viruses that would infect a file or maybe a floppy. And Charles was talking about SneakerNet earlier, right? That's how they would spread, is sharing a floppy, sharing a file like that. And so the countermeasure for this was virus scanners that would look at a volume when it was mounted, that would look at a file when it was copied onto the local hard drive, things like that. And so we see this game of leapfrog start to emerge between attackers and the countermeasures or the responses.
Yep.
As we move along.
Yeah, so we move away from floppies, right? And we kind of move into this internet age. And so the next round of these infectious types now becomes, hey, you can download stuff. You don't need someone to come by and battleship your floppy, right? It's just a matter at this point, you can get it any way you want it. And of course, things just kind of took off because when the internet came around, we were clicky, right? LimeWire, Napster, no, I'm just kidding. We were absolutely downloading everything we possibly could just for information purposes. But then that said, you know what? This is a great way to infect these people. So I'm going to move over to why we're here, right? Apple side, they said, you know what? We need to put forth some tools. Maybe they come after a little statement of saying, well, we don't need AV, but I won't mention that. Is Butcher still here? No? Okay. I don't want to make him mad, but nevertheless. So Apple starts putting forth these tools, right? File quarantine, MRT, XProtect. We got some dates up there, Gatekeeper. And again, this is this cat and mouse game. The new attack vector is let's grab things from the internet. So Apple starts kind of getting involved and says, you know what, we need to help out. So we started with AV, which does a very specific thing, right? It's a specific file, and then you had a virus, which is a very specific thing, and then you had antivirus, which was just the virus that was good, trying to get rid of the bad one, right? And so that's kind of what AV was. And then over time, around 2013, we start seeing that AV itself may not necessarily cut it. It's not like it's bad, it just may not cut it if you have a complex threat vector that you have to look at. So then we saw in 2013 the first eruptions of endpoint detection and response, EDR, right? And so Apple didn't come up with EDR, so don't be misled. That's just kind of the timeline here. But it then showed us that we were a little behind the curve because we started out looking for specific threats, And then we took care of those threats. And then we needed to actually dynamically look at things, but how do we do that? So we start doing these bulk scans, and we start like killing the performance on machines. And people have been suffering from the bloat of EDR, right? And so that kind of had a problem within and of itself. So what we had to do is start looking at what is the best way to detect and get analytics for those categories of malware and pup. I'm talking a lot. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, you're good. It's just, you can see this leapfrog, right? Where the attacks are getting more sophisticated. Doing a simple, file-based hash scan or a signature scan isn't going to find all those threats anymore. They're finding ways to mutate and change themselves so that the hash or signature doesn't match anymore. And so we need new tools to help detect these new threats. And that's where ESF comes in. It's becoming more resource intensive to just do a full file system scan. So Apple has provided a platform API that allows us and other EDR tools to look at file events in a more performant way, get the fire hose, I think Joe referred to it earlier, and use that to our advantage here in getting better at detections. So we want to talk a little bit about what ESF is.
Yeah, it made me think about something from a ESF perspective, right? When you look at like how it can improve the detect and response, again, you're mentioning it, but I kind of want to sit on it just a second. It has the ability to do file level or triggers based off of the individual file. All right, that's a huge savings in and of itself. And then it's our way to figure out what's going on the device. Because before, we were getting real dirty playing in the Kext and doing a lot of scraping and monitoring and pulling data off of Mac. And then, of course, that kind of came to an end around Catalina, right? So this is when ESF actually kind of came out. And so this is a great way to figure out what's really going on from the endpoint security framework. And it packs a powerful punch. So if you guys will walk with me here, what we'll do is we'll show you what we've got is like a little ESF stream, and we're going to take a look at just downloading MacKeeper, right? Not installing it, just downloading it. Remember this will be on the quiz. Just kidding. So a lot of stuff's happening, right? This is a lot more. This is just the ESF stream that we kind of have baked into the solution that we're working on. And at some point, you're looking and you're like, wow, there's a lot going on. Not every line is necessarily for the download in and of itself, but there's a lot going on if you were to dissect this. So not looking at every bit of the log, let's just look at some of the key pieces. Has anybody played with the ESF yet or starting to do work with the endpoint security framework? Okay, I've got a few. So what we're really looking for are kind of these events. These are our trigger events. So here's a few examples. This is not all, but there's a whole documentation and framework that you can take a look at. This one's talking about like file modified, file has been cloned, file has been created, file has been renamed. So this is actually cool because I can now say if something happens, meaning if there's an event and it is file create, I want to put some logic behind there and ask, let's check for some metadata, let's look for a couple characteristics, and then let's check it. Let's see if it's actually malware. Does it look like it? Does it smell like it? Does it match up? Does it kind of be, is it similar? So let's run it again. That was about 16 seconds. We're going to run it again, this time with the EDR solution in place using ESF as a trigger-based mechanism. Again, this is the second half of the quiz, so be prepared. All right, so we're cooking. It looks similar, but of course, this is a two-way conversation, and we're only seeing one half of it. The other half is the application or the agent that we'll write. But I'll call your attention to what's kind of happening here. There's a lot of processes that are missing. This only took 7 seconds rather than 16. Again, has anybody done a complete file scan of their entire Mac in 7 seconds? No. The idea here is that we looked at very particular file information that was triggered from the ESF. We also see that there was a network extension there was a file create, and then we see modify. It was only one file, and there's a bunch of modifications here. So that's telling me that something's going on, and then we have like an attribute change down at the bottom. So this is what it's like. Again, this is half the conversation, but I can quickly, and within about 7 seconds, look at what was happening in the form of a download, and already make a determination that I don't like this file. Let's keep moving. So in this leapfrog game of everything that's going on, we want to get to this point where we can say, stop. Don't continue on with this. The infection rate is getting too high. Antivirus may be missing a few gaps by looking at very specific files. We need something that's dynamic, and Apple has given us a great tool. So that was my plug for ESF. So certainly make our way to start using a lot more of the ESF. And then once you have all that, you kind of got to move to a response situation.
Yeah. So we've just been talking about how these threats can infect a system and how the detections have improved to find them. If software does get installed, a threat does get installed onto a system, there's only really a couple ways to maintain persistence on macOS. The main ones, launch agents, launch daemons. We could argue about login items. But there's a few well-known places that you can go and look to see if software has installed itself to, again, persist if user logs out, logs back in, or if the system reboots. How is it going to run? It's going to be one of these mechanisms. We'll move on, though, right, and not spend a lot of time on this. And just spend another moment talking about impact. So there could be a variety of things. In the case of MacKeeper, it's adware, right? The whole purpose of getting installed is so it can pop up ads and convince some percentage of people to click through them to generate revenue. But that's about it. It could impact productivity or some of these other things, Sid.
Yeah, I mean, really and truly, it just came in a very dirty way. It said, hey, we'll help you clean up your Mac. People clicked on it. It installed some stuff in the text. That way, it operated, it could operate without, even if you uninstalled it. And then at some point, that's the persistence piece. And then it starts bogging down your machine. So the thing you came here for is actually now worse, right? And so some people can argue, oh, MacKeeper's better. I'm never going to be convinced. So.
That's a fairly mild one, right? There could be worse ones that are scanning the system and looking for, secrets, looking for, in the U.S. social security numbers, looking for credit card numbers, things like that, and trying to steal them off the system. So the impact that the threat has will determine a little bit your response to it, but something else to keep in mind. We want to round this out by talking about compliance, and this is where a lot of this comes together. There's maybe an analogy here as well, right? All analogies run thin at some point, but there's maybe an analogy here as well where becoming an artist could involve a lot of different paths. There's some that are just masters of their instrument, some of which are here. Then there's guys like me that are maybe not the Joe Satriani or Jeff Beck or Eric Johnson, but more like Ed Sheeran, kind of a funny-looking bloke that is trying to put 4 chords together in a way that doesn't sound too much like a Marvin Gaye song. But with compliance, right? This is where you can put all this together and try to achieve your goal and really demonstrate that you're doing everything that you need to do. Now, there's 3 stages to this. We can talk about each one.
Yeah, and I think we'll go fast because I think we had a few minutes here. But really and truly, when we get to the compliance piece, there's like these 3. We would like you to understand that there's kind of 3 parts to this. One of them is the audit side, which you guys already know, but we'll get to that in a second. There's the guide part, which is where we start understanding some standards and some frameworks that are out there. That helps us set our configuration. So if your security team comes to you and says, do this, do this, do this, they may be looking through the guidance of one of those frameworks. I guess if you flip the card, it'll pop up a few on there just for reference. Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus is kind of popular over here. We've got, CIS, NIST, and things like that. That's a standard or a framework that you guys are typically following, whether you know it or not. And then again, the audit is probably what you're used to working through. That's where they want all the examples, the pictures, show me your administration, you tell them to pop off. Like that's not happening. Give me access to your MDM. But nevertheless, it's a good exercise because it shows you, while you're not in threat mode, it shows you, hey, let's take a look. Are you really prepared for if something were to happen? And then finally, we'll look at some of the reports that we can get that does kind of certify us that you can trust, working with us and things like that. So this is one way to kind of think through the guide, audit, and report.
Yeah, and for you and your organization, you want to borrow from these and figure out how you want to apply it to your work and your role and what you're doing. In some cases, you'll be required to follow a particular guide in order to meet a contractual requirement or work in a certain industry. But even then, and for all of the rest of us, we want to look at all of these and figure out what we want to use so that we can get that report and have an action plan for what we're going to do. It's much better, right, to do all this in a sound check than when you're performing live, right? So think of your audit that way. Yeah. All of this, right, to get to that rock star level status. The good news here is that as a MacAdmin, you have all of the tools. You're in charge of many of the tools that you need to respond to all of these. You're responsible for securing the endpoint. You have the ability to apply security controls and policies to that device. You can update the software to make sure that you're managing vulnerabilities in a responsible way. You have the MDM is the key to provide entitlements to your security software. We wouldn't have full disk access. None of the tools that are available would have full disk access without that proper entitlement from MDM. So you are a critical part of this whole conversation, and what we want is for you to have that seat at the table, for your voice to be heard, for you to be involved in these conversations if you're working with the security team, or maybe you're solely responsible for this. Have all of the tools that you need to be successful. I know that being a MacAdmin is a difficult job and you're asked to do a lot. I like to pride myself on working hard, right? I think I work hard. Most days when I lay my head down on the pillow, I think I've done all I could that day. But there's never a day, right, when I lay down and think I've done all that needs to be done or all that could be done. There's always something more. And you might have a bit of that response to our presentation. Well, I've done all that I could. I don't know that I could do more. But I do hope that when we're back next year at MacAduck again, that we can have a conversation about how you've been able to expand your practice, incorporate more security into what you're doing, so that when you lay your head down at night, you can think, I've done more today than I've done before. That's what I wish for all of you. It's great to be here. We're so glad to be a part of MacAduck. There's an appendix of resources you can get later with the slides and with the information that's distributed. But thank you so much for your time and attention. Glad to be here. Enjoy the rest of the show.